BBC World News, I'm Samantha Simmons. Our top stories. Pay us in rubles from tomorrow or we'll cancel your gas contracts. The stark warning from Russian President Vladimir Putin to Western countries.
Nobody sells us free of charge anything, and we're not going to do charity either. All the existing contracts will be suspended.
Intelligence chiefs in the UK and US say Vladimir Putin has massively misjudged the situation in Ukraine, with advisers not telling the president the truth about the situation on the ground. In the southern city of Mariupol, a one-day ceasefire has been declared to try and help residents flee from the bombing. From one nightmare to another, the refugees from war struggling to get a visa to come to the UK. Welcome. Russian President Vladimir Putin says that starting from Friday, foreign buyers must pay for gas in the Russian currency and has threatened to halt gas supply contracts if payments in rubles are not made from accounts in Russian banks.
Today I signed a decree setting up the rules of trading of Russian gas, natural gas, with so-called unfriendly states. We suggest to our counterparties from those countries a clear and transparent scheme. In order to purchase Russian natural gas, they should open ruble accounts in the Russian banks. It's exactly from those accounts payments will be executed for the gas supplied starting from tomorrow, from April the 1st. In case such payments fail and not executed, we'll consider them as non-payment from our counterparties. Nobody sells us free of charge anything, and we're not going to do charity either. All the existing contracts will be suspended.
Let's get the latest live now from Moscow with our correspondent Jenny Hill. Jenny, welcome to you. Vladimir Putin warned or threatened of this last week, and now it seems he is going ahead with the threat. What more did he say?
Yeah, before I tell you more about what he had to say, I think it's probably worth talking about what's actually in this decree he signed and what this actually means in practice. Because those Western countries will not have to hand over rubles for gas. What will happen is that Russia has set up a special mechanism. So your average Western country, say Germany, will pay euros into a special bank account at Gazprom Bank. The bank will then take that currency, trade it on the stock exchange here in return for rubles. The rubles will then go back into a second Russian bank account from which the payment will be made in return for the gas. So in practice, it's rather different from this, great headline that Western companies will have to come up with rubles for the gas, otherwise they're going to get cut off. So we'll have to see how this actually starts to work. But I think it's important just outlining that the actual, in practice, is a little bit more convoluted than perhaps Mr. Putin is suggesting in that press statement.
So that would imply that we've had reaction from Germany and France already, rejecting these demands that they pay for gas in rubles. Is there, though, a compromise, do you think?
Well, this sounds, on the face of it, to almost be a bit of a compromise. We know that Vladimir Putin outlined this mechanism on the telephone to Olaf Scholz last night. Now, Mr. Scholz came away, by all accounts, a little bit confused, but the headlines last night in Germany were saying it looks as though we will be able to technically pay in euros. So let's see what countries make of this, but certainly worth bearing in mind how this is going to work in practical terms. There's no doubt that Vladimir Putin is on really belligerent form this afternoon. Look, his country is really burdened by sanctions. The invasion hasn't perhaps gone as well as he wanted it to, but he is really hitting back, rhetorically at least, against the West. In this speech, this televised speech, he was blaming the West for waging an economic war against Russia, a war that it's been waging, he said, for years now. The West would have brought in sanctions against us anyway. They'd have found an excuse excuse. This was, I think, very much, or at least in part, focused on his domestic audience. He's telling them that Western sanctions are the price Russia has to pay for its freedom and independence.
He's walking a bit of a tightrope, isn't he, though? Because while Europe is heavily dependent on Russian gas, Germany in particular, they are already looking elsewhere. Does he think that he's got them over a barrel in that they will have to comply, otherwise they will risk having no gas?
It's really hard to know what's inside Vladimir Putin's head. We know, of course, that he'd quite like to sell some of those natural resources to other countries, perhaps China, for example. But he knows, too, that, the money coming in from Western countries in return for gas in particular is important. But I think, as we've seen throughout the last few weeks, he has told Russian people it could get tough. You know, these sanctions, international isolation are going to make it tough for the Russian economy. But he tends to trot out two narratives in relation to that. The first is the West is going to suffer as a result of these sanctions too, and we've just seen a little bit more of that actually. He's warning Europeans they're going to see massive job losses as a result of global instability. He said too that there's going to be a migrant crisis, in a wave of migrants into Europe again. And he also tells Russians that this is Western aggression and that Russia is just going to have to crack on with it and do its best and get through it. And I think we saw a little bit of this earlier from his spokesman, actually, when he was talking about those intelligence reports that suggested that Vladimir Putin wasn't entirely in touch with what was happening in Ukraine and had been poorly advised. The Kremlin sought there to say that the West doesn't really understand the Kremlin. It doesn't understand Vladimir Putin or the way that Russia makes decisions. And I think there is something going on there in the way that Russia is trying to suggest that it is different, obviously, from the West, but it is a different place that does things in its own way. It's drawing up that drawbridge, if you like.
OK, Jenny Hill in Moscow, thank you. Well, with me now to discuss more on this is our business presenter, Victoria Fritz. Hi, Victoria.
Hi.
So hearing a bit more from Jenny there about how this will work and more about the response from Europe. Just fill us in.
OK, so I'm glad Jenny did the hard bit and explained how Russia thinks this is certainly going to work in terms of the money going via Gazprom Bank. But, I mean, essentially, this is sort of almost for Europe the worst April's Fool's joke ever. And nobody is laughing because what Putin is saying here is if you don't effectively pay for our gas in rubles, which way you want to do it, and via our own bank accounts, we will not give you gas. And if you try and pay via euros or dollars, those payments will be blocked. Now, it's interesting this. Putin is saying that Europe will therefore be forced to get its LNG, its liquefied natural gas from the United States. And it does go back on promises that Putin had made with Italy and Germany over Euro gas purchases that we understood were made at the beginning of the week. Now, we do understand from European countries, Germany, the economy minister there, saying that we're prepared for anything that Putin might do and that Europe will not be blackmailed. France and Germany very much preparing for the possible scenario of Russia turning off the taps. Insofar as whether or not that is possible and what impact that would have, it very much depends on a number of related factors, things like consumption, things like weather patterns. So if there's a lot of heating going on in Europe at any one time, then the storage facilities are empty, and places like Germany don't actually have a huge amount of storage facilities. Every country does this slightly differently, but they tend to have pipelines in and then pipelines straight out. The same is true of Italy as well. And so it's those countries that might struggle a little bit more if all of a sudden there was less Russian gas about. The other thing to consider here is if Russia decides that Europe isn't going to get its gas, well, where else is it going to go? Because at the moment, it's producing something like 170 to 200 billion cubic meters. And that kind of volume, that's got to go really via pipelines. You can't get that amount of gas onto boats and send them elsewhere, send them to, other parts of the world. So what does it do? So, you know, perhaps you're looking at China maybe, and there have been commitments from Russia and China to build a Siberian pipeline, but that's not going to come on until about 2030. And we're talking about something like 30 billion cubic meters, so nothing like the amount that it's currently sending to Europe. So this is very much a stake, you know, political brinkmanship, I guess, from both Russia, who are looking to shore up the strength of the ruble that has, quite frankly, completely collapsed since the invasion, and also Europe as well, that is very, very reliant. 44% S&P, Andy Critchlow was telling me, the guy over at S&P was telling me, 44% of Europe's gas needs are currently met by Russia. So we are looking at emergency plans. What will happen tomorrow is very, very hard to predict at this stage. What we can say for sure is that the gas markets are going to respond to this news. This has very much ratcheted up in the last hour or so. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the markets and across the world when it comes to gas.
Of course, with prices rocket high already.
Exactly.
Victoria, thank you very much for your analysis. Well, let's talk now to Jane Foley, Head of Foreign Exchange Strategy at the Dutch bank Rabobank. Jane, welcome to you. Thanks very much for being with us. We were talking just last week about this threat from Vladimir Putin to do just this. What's your reaction to what he said in the past hour?
It's of considerable concern, quite clearly, and it's quite interesting in the markets, because the markets over the last week or so, when we first began to hear about this news, has been relatively optimistic, perhaps assuming that it really wouldn't go this far. But of course, the news today suggests that actually Europe does run the risk of seeing some blackouts. Now, yesterday, of course, we had Germany announce that it was going to the first tier of a three-stage plan, which could, if it goes to stage 3, result in energy rationing. So clearly, countries like Germany and also Austria have been really looking at this with quite some seriousness. And I think the markets are begun to realise that this could mean a potential blackout, certainly shorter industrial production for Germany. And that has considerable implications for the economic output for the whole of Europe.
What's your analysis of this special mechanism we're hearing about, so that Russia's not saying you have to literally hand over rubles, you'll pay with your currency via another bank, and that will be traded and we'll get rubles back?
Well, of course, this is just a mechanism really to bypass the sanctions, which clearly make trading in the ruble very difficult now for most entities. So this is just the mechanism. Clearly, the Europeans could get around their own sanctions if they needed to do so. But really behind this is Putin's want to strengthen the ruble. Now, we saw a massive sell-off in the value of the ruble at the start of the war. It has won back quite a lot of ground, but it's still around about 17% or so weaker than it was at the end of last year. And we've got to consider what's happening in the Russian economy. There is a lot of inflation. Economists now predicting that the economy could contract in terms of the size of its GDP for 2 consecutive years. That's a huge recessionary backdrop. So yes, they have raised interest rates, the central bank there to raise interest rates, which would help stabilize a currency naturally. They've put on capital controls to do this, but it would be far better if Putin could get the Europeans, maybe the Japanese, to buy ruble and then use that to pay for their gas or for their oil. And that is what he's trying to do, to really try and take out some of that inflationary pressure from the Russian economy.
It feels like everyone's a possible loser here, doesn't it? For Europe, they could have their gas supplies turned off, but for Putin, he could see a massive drop in revenue, and when they're already facing huge sanctions.
Well, you know, this is why the stakes are so high. I mean, clearly for Europe, we need the gas, particularly as you mentioned, a country like Germany. 40% of the gas in 2020 comes from Russia into the EU. About 20%, by way of comparison, came from Norway, and they are producing more in Norway to try and alleviate some of this pain. But of course, as you mentioned, Putin needs that revenue. This war is costly. Even if they were to make some successes in Ukraine, it will be very costly to try and maintain that. So they need that revenue, and also they need to try and take away some of that economic pain from the Russian people. So if this is a game of chicken, the stakes are enormously high.
Okay, Jane Foley from Rabobank, thank you very much for joining us. Now, American and British intelligence officials say President Putin is not being given an accurate picture of events on the ground in Ukraine. A White House spokesman said Mr. Putin was being misled by advisers who were too scared to tell him how badly the war is going for Russia. That view was echoed by Sir Jeremy Fleming, the head of the UK Security and Intelligence Agency, GCHQ. He also said that Mr. Putin had overestimated the abilities of his military to secure a rapid victory. Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera reports.
What's really going on inside the Kremlin? And just how isolated is Russia's leadership from the reality of events in Ukraine? Western spies say they believe Vladimir Putin is not getting the full picture. Speaking in Australia, the head of Britain's GCHQ intelligence agency said Putin had got things badly wrong.
It's clear he's misjudged the resistance of the Ukrainian people. He underestimated the strength of the coalition his actions would galvanise. He underplayed the economic consequences of the sanctions regime. And he overestimated the abilities of his military to secure a rapid victory.
Morale in the Russian military was low, he said, troops sabotaging their equipment and even accidentally shooting down their own aircraft. But Putin had been shielded from the full reality.
And even though we believe Putin's advisers are afraid to tell him the truth, what's going on and the extent of these misjudgments must be crystal clear to the regime.
The GCHQ director's comments echo those of US officials who said they thought Putin was being misled and that there was growing tension between him and Russian defense officials.
We would concur with the conclusion that Mr. Putin has not been fully informed by his Ministry of Defense at every turn over the last month.
Western spies seem to have had real insight into the Kremlin. They warned well in advance the invasion would take place and that Putin was misjudging how it would play out. Now they think he's still not being told the full truth about what's really going on in Ukraine, and that worries them because it means he might make further misjudgments which could extend the war. On the ground, the war has not gone according to Vladimir Putin's original plan. What's not clear, though, is how far he understands that and what he will do next. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.
The Ukrainian government has sent 45 buses to evacuate civilians from the devastated southern port of Mariupol, where tens of thousands of people have endured weeks of Russian bombardment. Russia has agreed a one-day ceasefire to allow people to leave, although there is scepticism that it will hold. This is the latest map of Russian positions in Ukraine. The US says only a fifth of Russian forces around the capital Kyiv have actually moved from the area, despite a declaration by Russia earlier in the week that it would pull back from there and focus on the east of the country. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says Russian units are not withdrawing, but repositioning. From Lviv, our correspondent Anna Foster sent this report.
5 weeks into this war, Ukraine is bracing itself for a new offensive. Its forces are now preparing to resist a fresh assault on the eastern Donbass region. Days after Russia said it would move troops away from the capital Kyiv, the city still reverberates with the sound of shelling.
We do not believe anyone. We do not trust any beautiful verbal constructions. There's a real situation on the battlefield, and now this is the most important thing. We will not give up anything, and we will fight for every metre of our land and for every person.
Here in Lviv and across Ukraine, there's real anger towards the Russian invaders.
You know, emotionally, how do you feel about Russia?
Emotionally, I just hate them. We are Ukrainians, we have our own country. We have our own culture, and we will keep it.
For millions of people, this city has been a gateway, a route out of this war. Those who stayed behind share their pain.
I don't feel these people are strangers. They are sisters and brothers. Truly painful. It tears me apart. And today it's 4 million people, and there's a possibility it will be 6 million people tomorrow. And it also can come to my family and my home.
In the besieged city of Mariupol, thousands have been trapped for weeks. There's no power, and medicine, food and water are hard to find. This satellite image shows hundreds of people queuing outside a supermarket. Stranded and cut off, getting hold of food has been tough.
We are dog poor, standing by the fire, homeless. How long is it going to take? We have nowhere to take a shower. We're drinking water from God knows where.
The Ukrainian government has now sent 45 evacuation buses to Mariupol. Today, Russia says it'll briefly cease fire there so people can finally leave. But that promise has been made before and broken. Anna Foster, BBC News, Lviv.
Out of the more than 4 million people who fled Ukraine, over 2.3 million are now in Poland. The Polish city of Lublin has been widely praised for how NGOs, local government and volunteers have worked together to provide support for refugees, both immediately after the invasion and now, 1 month on, to integrate refugees into schools, workplaces and life in the city. Kasia Madeira has more.
Just hours after the war started, people in Lublin rallied together to create a community to support Ukrainian refugees because they knew that there was going to be a lot of people who needed support, who would be fleeing Ukraine. Now, a month into this war, what we've got here is a school, a primary school in the centre of Lublin that is taking in lots and lots of children who have fled from the war. And along with that, they're also offering teachers jobs here, which is really important because it means that teachers who are working here can then independently support themselves. Now, we met one of those teachers earlier on. We're coming to the end of our school day and Tatiana is back. Tatiana, and you've got a student as well with you. Who's this?
This is a young lady. You can see that she's very beautiful, charming. Her name is, what is your name? What is your name?
My name's Solomia.
Solomia is from Ukraine too. She is from, where are you from? Volodymyr? Volynski, am I right? She is from Volodymyr Volynski, and I made friends with her because she is a girl whom I noticed, and we started to communicate with each other. We started to speak with each other. I knew a lot about her. I know that she likes sports. Her favorite fruit is mango, exotic fruit. She likes potatoes, tomatoes, carrot. And she is very optimistic. What is more, Solomia had lots of homework in Ukraine, and here she can. She feels relaxed because there is almost no homework.
Well, no homework just yet, but now you're starting to work here. But you're now enrolled as a member of the teaching staff, and you're going to be supporting children like this little girl.
Yes, of course, I will try to help such kind of girls, boys, kids from Ukraine, and of course, it is very interesting to communicate with Polish children.
Because, of course, you're also learning Polish as well.
Yes. Even very soon I have got the courses, Polish courses, which organized the city council. And we are thankful because it's really a challenge for me. I don't know the Polish language, and I had to study it, to communicate and to understand people, teachers, kids better.
But this is an absolute example. Tatiana, thank you so much. Thank you. This is an absolute example of how people who just a month ago, Tatiana was a teacher in a school, Solomia was at her own school, they had to flee Ukraine. They're now being integrated into schools like this one in Lublin. Lublin, very unique because it's offering teachers jobs, paid for work, so that these people can support themselves and be independent. Another really fascinating aspect is that what the local NGOs are doing is also offering debit cards for refugees who are very vulnerable so that they can also support themselves. This is, of course, something that will need to be looked at in the long term, because how long, we simply don't know. These people will need to be here for, many of them, their homes back in places like Mariupol absolutely razed. So it's a really, really big step in giving these people independence, in supporting them, because we don't know how long they're going to be here. But classes like this, the integration has been phenomenal. The percentage of pupils increased here has been by 10%. Lublin has seen its population increased by 10%. And this is happening across this country that has received nearly 2.5 million refugees from Ukraine.
My colleague Kasia Madeira there. Palestinian officials say 2 men were killed during a raid in the West Bank city of Jenin. The health ministry said 15 other people were wounded during the operation. This follows renewed violence in the region, which has seen 11 Israelis killed over the past 2 weeks. Our Middle East correspondent Yulan Nell has the latest.
The Israeli military says that its soldiers entered Jenin to carry out several arrests, including those of 2 people who are suspected of helping a Palestinian man who carried out an attack in a Tel Aviv suburb earlier this week, shooting dead 5 people. Now, in the clashes in Jenin, as well as those killed, several people were injured. It's all led to fresh threats from a Palestinian militant group. There's been condemnation from the Palestinian president as well. And meanwhile, we're hearing that in the south of the West Bank, a Palestinian stabbed an Israeli man on a bus with a screwdriver close to a Jewish settlement before he was actually shot by another passenger. And this violence, this continuing trend really of violence that we're seeing is in the run-up to a sensitive time when you have Muslim, Jewish and Christian holidays all set to overlap.
Yulan Nell there. Let's just remind you of our breaking news this hour. In a televised address, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced that starting from tomorrow, Friday, foreign buyers must pay for Russian gas in Russian currency, the ruble. He said gas supply contracts will be halted if these payments in rubles were not made from accounts in Russian banks. We'll have plenty more analysis on that announcement and what it's going to mean for Europe. Stay with us here at BBC World News. You can reach me on Twitter at Samantha TV News.
We empower those who act. Those who see the correlation between upswings and downswings. Those who manage risk by meeting each obstacle with a perfectly executed strategy. A measured approach, the right tools, driving accuracy. CME Group, where risk meets opportunity.
Grana Padano, grated or in chunks, adds an extra Italian touch to all your dishes. Grana Padano, the world's best-selling PDO cheese.
As the sun rises over the Caspian, get ready to embrace the day. Come and listen to the whispering sea make the most of Azerbaijan. With its mountainous beauty, just stop for a second. Take in the incredible landscapes. Experience them every way you can. Reconnect with nature. Set your spirit free. Azerbaijan. Take another look.
Hello and welcome along to our latest thoughts on how the weather's going to pan out right across Europe in the coming days. Quite a contrast, just depends where you are at the moment, and that's very much driven by this big area of low pressure. It's throwing this band of cloud ever further north, ever further east. Ahead of it, things are relatively mild but oh so wet, especially so across the Balkan Peninsula, where we've seen easily 100, 150 millimetres of rain in a number of locations, and there is more to come during the day on Friday. Around about the Black Sea, things, as I say, are on the mild side. There's plenty of sunshine there just at the moment, a real taste of spring. But that rain will eventually move a little bit further towards the east, allowing something a little bit drier to break out across a good part of Iberia and into the western Mediterranean. But as the low moves east, in comes the cold air all the way from Scandinavia right across northern and western Europe through the British Isles and down into Iberia. And because we've got that clash of the mild air in the south, the colder air to the north, don't be at all surprised to see significant snowfall in quite a broad stripe right across the heart of Europe as we get on through Saturday, and all the while those temperatures really struggling across northern and western areas. And there will be significant snowfall. As I say, there are quite a number of warnings, for example, from both the French and also from the Spanish authorities. And look how those temperatures really take a tumble across Eastern Europe in the coming days. Take care.